I've been a forest warden for over 25 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things. I've dealt with everything from reckless hikers who think they're invincible to experienced backpackers who find themselves disoriented in the dense wilderness, bewildered by the endless expanse of trees. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I encountered in the summer of 2012. My name is Jack Hawthorne, and I was stationed at Blackwood National Park, a remote wilderness area in the Pacific Northwest. It's a place where the ancient trees tower so high they seem to scrape the sky, and the fog rolls in so thick you could cut it with a knife. Blackwood is a place where the boundaries between reality and legend often seemed to blur, a place where, if you listened closely enough, the forest whispered secrets you were never meant to hear. The summer of 2012 had been unusually dry, and with the looming threat of wildfires, I spent most of my days patrolling the trails, ensuring that visitors adhered to the strict fire regulations. The park was quieter than usual, with fewer tourists braving the sweltering heat and the risk of wildfire. But there was one group that stood out, a small family that had decided to camp deep within the forest, far from the designated camping areas. I first encountered them one crisp morning as I made my rounds. There was Thomas Sullivan, a man in his late 30s with a scruffy beard and eager eyes. His wife Sarah, a petite woman with a warm smile and a cautious demeanor, and their young daughter Emma, a precocious 8-year-old with wild curls and an insatiable curiosity. They were cheerful, excited to be in the wilderness and eager to experience nature in its rawest form. "You folks know you're pretty far off the beaten path, right?" I asked, eyeing their heavy backpacks and camping gear. Thomas grinned, his eyes gleaming with a kind of reckless abandon. "That's the whole point, Warden. We're here for the full experience. The further from civilization, the better." I warned them about the dangers of camping outside the designated areas, but they seemed unfazed, even brushing off my concerns with light-hearted jokes. Sarah looked a bit nervous, but Emma was bouncing with excitement, pointing at every bird and squirrel she saw. "Just be careful," I said sternly. "Stay on the trails and make sure you have enough supplies. Cell reception is spotty out here, and it's easy to get turned around." They nodded, though I could tell Thomas was only half listening. As they headed off into the dense forest, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. Maybe it was the way Thomas's eyes gleamed with that reckless abandon, or perhaps it was just my instincts honed by years in the wilderness. But they were within their rights to camp wherever they wished, so I let them go, with one last reminder to be careful. A few days passed, and I didn't think much about the Sullivan family until I noticed that their car was still parked in the same spot near the trailhead. It wasn't unusual for people to spend a few days camping, but something gnawed at me, a feeling that I couldn't quite shake. I decided to check on them, just to be sure they were okay. The hike to where they'd set up camp was about 5 miles off the main trail, through dense underbrush and along paths that were more animal tracks than human trails. It was the kind of place where few dared to venture, a place where the forest closed in around you, muffling the sounds of the outside world. As I approached their campsite, the first thing that struck me was the silence. The usual forest sounds, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, even the distant hum of insects, were absent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself moving more cautiously, my hand resting on the bear spray at my hip. The campsite itself was a mess. The tent was torn, one of the poles snapped in half, and the remnants of their gear were scattered across the ground. But what caught my attention most was the fire pit. It was surrounded by small, twisted figures made from sticks and twine, arranged in a circle around the ashes. The figures looked like crude representations of people, their limbs contorted into unnatural positions. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Mr. Sullivan? Mrs. Sullivan? Emma? Is anyone here?" There was no response. My heart raced as I searched the area, hoping to find the family safe and sound. But the more I looked, the more apparent it became that they were gone. vanished without a trace. I radioed for backup, and soon a search team was combing the forest. We searched for days, but there was no sign of the Sullivans. No tracks, no belongings, nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. The only clue we had was a notebook I found near the remains of their campfire. It belonged to Thomas, filled with sketches of the forest and notes about their trip. But toward the end of the notebook, the sketches became darker, more frantic. The last few pages were covered in drawings of strange creatures, tall, shadowy figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, blending into the trees. The notes became erratic, with phrases like, "It watches us," and "We are not alone," scrawled in the margins. The search was eventually called off, and the official report listed the Sullivan family as missing, presumed dead. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister had happened. I've always been a rational man, someone who believes in facts and logic. But after that summer, I started to question everything I thought I knew. I spent countless nights poring over Thomas's notebook, trying to make sense of the drawings and the cryptic notes. I even began researching local legends and folklore, desperate to find an explanation for what had happened. That's when I stumbled upon stories of a creature known to the indigenous tribes of the area, a being they called the Wendigo. According to legend, the Wendigo was a spirit of the forest, a malevolent force that preyed on those who ventured too deep into the woods. It was said to be a creature of insatiable hunger, one that could take on the form of a human or animal, but always with something off. Eyes that were too large, limbs that moved in unnatural ways. The more I read, the more the pieces seemed to fit. The Sullivans had camped in an area known for strange disappearances, a place where even the locals refused to go. And the sketches in Thomas's notebook, those twisted, shadowy figures, looked eerily similar to the descriptions of the Wendigo. I knew it sounded crazy, but the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that the Sullivans had encountered something in the woods, something ancient and hungry. I tried to tell myself that it was just a legend, that there was a logical explanation for what had happened. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it. I couldn't forget the silence at their campsite, the way the forest had seemed to close in around me, and those stick figures arranged around the fire pit like some kind of offering. I kept the notebook, though I never showed it to anyone else. I didn't want to be labeled as a crackpot, another warden who'd spent too much time alone in the woods. But I couldn't bring myself to throw it away either. It was a reminder of that summer, of the family that had vanished without a trace, and of the secrets the forest kept hidden. Years passed, and I tried to put it behind me, but every time I patrolled that part of the forest, I felt it. The weight of the trees pressing down, the feeling that something was watching from the shadows. I'd hear things too, strange noises in the night that I couldn't quite explain, rustling in the underbrush, whispers carried on the wind, and once the sound of footsteps trailing behind me. Though when I turned, there was no one there. Then, about 5 years after the incident, I got a call from a young couple who had decided to go hiking in the same area where the Sullivans had disappeared. They were frantic, saying they'd found something strange in the woods, something that made them feel like they were being watched. I rushed out to meet them, and when I arrived, they led me to a small clearing not far from the old campsite. The first thing I noticed was the smell, a rancid, rotting stench that hung in the air like a thick fog. The couple pointed to a large tree at the edge of the clearing, and that's when I saw it. There, hanging from the branches, were more of those twisted stick figures, just like the ones I'd found years ago. But these were different. They were larger, more intricate, and each one had something tied to it. Pieces of cloth, small bones, even strands of hair. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached the tree, the ground beneath my feet soft and spongy. And then I saw what was causing the smell. At the base of the tree was a shallow pit, half covered with dirt and leaves. Inside were the remains of a body, badly decomposed and almost unrecognizable. But I knew deep down that it was Thomas Sullivan. His clothes, though tattered and stained, matched the description in the missing persons report. The sight of that body confirmed what I had feared all along, that something in those woods had taken the Sullivan family, something that was still out there, waiting. We called in the authorities, and the area was cordoned off for investigation. The official report listed the death as an animal attack, but I knew better. The way the body had been hidden, the stick figures hanging from the tree, it wasn't the work of any animal I'd ever encountered. After that, I refused to patrol that part of the forest alone. I didn't care what anyone thought. I'd seen enough, and I wasn't going to be the next one to disappear. To this day, I still don't know what really happened to the Sullivans, or what I encountered in those woods. But I do know this. There are places in this world where the lines between reality and legend blur. Places where the old stories are more than just tales to scare children. And sometimes, if you're not careful, those stories have a way of finding you. I left the Park Service a few years after the discovery of Thomas's body. The nightmares were getting worse, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. I moved to a small town far from Blackwood Forest, trying to put as much distance between myself and those woods as possible. But even now, I can't escape it. Every so often, I'll hear something in the night, a soft rustling, a faint whisper carried on the breeze, and I'll find myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if it's found me again. I can't help but think back to that summer, to the Sullivan family that vanished without a trace, and to the twisted figures hanging from the trees like dark omens. There are some things in this world that we're not meant to understand, things that defy explanation, and sometimes the only thing you can do is survive long enough to tell the story. But that doesn't mean you're safe, because the forest never forgets, and neither does the thing that lives within it. As I sit here writing this account, I can't help but wonder if sharing this story is wise. Part of me hopes that by putting it out there, I might find others who have experienced similar things, that together we might unravel the mystery of what lurks in the depths of Blackwood Forest. But another part of me fears that by speaking its name, by acknowledging its existence, I might be inviting it into my life once more. I've tried to move on, to build a new life away from the shadows of the forest. I got married, had kids of my own, but I've never told them about what happened in Blackwood. How could I? They'd think I was crazy, or worse, they'd believe me and live their lives in fear of something they can't see or understand. But sometimes, when we're out camping or hiking, I'll catch myself scanning the tree line, looking for those elongated shadows, listening for whispers on the wind. And I'll hold my children a little closer, urging them to stay on the trail, to respect the wilderness but never to trust it completely. Because I know now that there are ancient things in this world, things that have existed long before us and will continue long after we're gone. Things that see us not as the dominant species we believe ourselves to be, but as prey, as playthings, as sacrifices to powers we can't comprehend. I don't know if what took the Sullivans was truly the Wendigo of legend, or something else entirely, but I do know that it's still out there, waiting. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if it's not just confined to Blackwood Forest. What if there are other places, other forests, where similar entities lurk? What if they're spreading, growing stronger as we push further into their domains? These are the thoughts that keep me up at night, that make me double-check the locks on my doors and windows. Because deep down, I know that no matter how far I run, no matter how much I try to forget, a part of me will always be back in those woods, standing in that clearing, surrounded by those twisted stick figures and the lingering scent of decay. So if you're reading this, consider it a warning. Respect the wilderness, enjoy its beauty, but never forget that there are places where humans don't belong, places where the old magic still holds sway, where ancient hunger still roams free. And if you ever find yourself in a forest where the silence is too deep, where the shadows seem to move of their own accord, remember the story of the Sullivans. Remember and run, because in the end, that might be all you can do. Run and hope that whatever's chasing you isn't faster, isn't hungrier, isn't more patient than you are. And pray that if you do escape, it doesn't follow you home. As for me, I'll keep watching, keep listening, because even though I've left the forest, I'm not sure the forest has ever truly left me. And in the whisper of the wind through the trees, in the creak of a floorboard in the dead of night, I'll always be listening for the call of the Wendigo, hoping against hope that it hasn't found me again. Because in Blackwood Forest, and perhaps in other dark corners of the world, the line between legend and reality is thinner than we'd like to believe. And sometimes the stories we tell around the campfire are more than just stories. Sometimes they're warnings. Warnings we'd do well to heed. So the next time you're in the wilderness and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense that something's watching you from just beyond the tree line, don't ignore it. Don't brush it off as imagination or nerves. Because maybe, just maybe, there's something out there in the darkness. Something hungry. Something patient. Something that's been waiting a very, very long time for you to wander just a little too far off the path. And if you hear a whisper on the wind, a voice that sounds almost, but not quite human, well, then it might already be too late. But you can try running. It's what I did. And somehow, against all odds, I survived to tell this tale. But remember, just because you can't see it, doesn't mean it's not there. Just because you've left the forest, doesn't mean the forest has left you. So be careful out there. And whatever you do, don't go looking for the Wendigo, because you just might find it. Or worse, it might find you. I always thought Oakwood Grove National Forest was my sanctuary. A place where the chaotic noise of the world fell silent, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the whisper of the wind. I'd spent the better part of 2 decades as a park ranger, patrolling the remote expanses of this wilderness that few had the patience or desire to explore. The deeper you went, the more the forest seemed to close in on itself, swallowing trails and landmarks, as if it wanted to keep its secrets hidden. My name is Alex Thornton, and I've called these woods home since I was fresh out of college, eager to escape the confines of city life and immerse myself in nature. Now, at 43, I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The forest had become a part of me, its rhythms as familiar as my own heartbeat. It was late October 2019. The weather had turned crisp, and the trees were a kaleidoscope of orange and red. The season brought a wave of visitors eager to capture the last vestiges of autumn before winter cloaked the land in snow. But the numbers dwindled as the days grew shorter. And by the end of the month, the park was nearly empty, save for the occasional hiker or hunter. I was on a routine patrol when I first heard about the missing girl. The call came over my radio just as I was finishing up my rounds near Whispering Pines Campground, a popular spot for weekend warriors looking to get a taste of the great outdoors without venturing too far from civilization. "Alex, you there?" The voice belonged to Sarah Martinez, one of our newer rangers. She'd only been with us for a year, but she'd already proven herself to be sharp and reliable. "Go ahead, Sarah," I responded, my breath forming small clouds in the chilly air. "We've got a situation. A group of campers just reported their friend missing. She went for a hike yesterday afternoon and never came back." I felt a knot form in my stomach. In my years at Oakwood Grove, we'd had our share of lost hikers, but something in Sarah's voice told me this was different. "I'm on my way back to HQ now," I said, already turning towards my truck. "Fill me in on the details." As I drove back to the ranger station, Sarah briefed me on what we knew. The missing girl's name was Lily Chen, a 21-year-old college student who had come to the park with a group of friends for a weekend of camping. They'd set up at Whispering Pines, a safe, well-trodden spot where you could still see the glow of other campfires in the distance. Lily had wandered off on her own one afternoon, probably looking to take some pictures or enjoy the solitude, but she never came back. Her friends searched for her, shouting her name until their voices were hoarse, but there was no sign of her. By the time they reported her missing to the park headquarters, night had already fallen, and the search was delayed until morning. I pulled into the parking lot of our small ranger station, a rustic log cabin that had stood watch over Oakwood Grove for nearly a century. As I walked in, I could feel the tension in the air. Sarah was there, along with our chief ranger, Frank Delgado, and a group of 4 young people who looked like they hadn't slept in days. One of them, a tall young man with dark hair and red-rimmed eyes, stood up as I entered. "Are you in charge here?" he asked, his voice strained with worry and fatigue. I shook my head. "That would be Chief Delgado," I said, nodding towards Frank. "I'm Ranger Thornton. I'll be helping with the search." Frank motioned for me to join them at the large map of Oakwood Grove spread out on the table. "Alex, this is Jason, Mia, Dev, and Zoe," he said, indicating each of the young people in turn. "They're Lily's friends." I nodded to each of them, noting the fear and guilt etched on their faces. They were young, barely out of their teens and clearly shaken. Jason, the one who had spoken to me, kept repeating how they should have stayed together, how it was his fault for letting Lily go off alone. "Did she mention where she was going?" I asked, jotting down notes in my weathered notebook. Jason shook his head. "No, she just said she wanted to explore a bit, take some pictures. We thought she'd be back in an hour or so." The others nodded, their expressions a mix of guilt and fear. They weren't the first to lose someone in Oakwood Grove. The park had a reputation, not widely known, but whispered among locals. People went missing here. It didn't happen often, but when it did, they were rarely found. The ones who were, well, they came back different, if they came back at all. I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the task at hand. "All right," I said, turning to Frank. "What's our plan?" Frank pointed to the map. "We'll start at first light. 2 teams, one heading east from the campsite, the other west. We'll comb through in a grid pattern, focusing on the areas within a 5-mile radius of where Lily was last seen." I nodded, already mentally preparing for what would likely be a long and grueling search. As I looked at the worried faces of Lily's friends, I felt a renewed sense of determination. We would find her. We had to. Little did I know that this search would lead us down a path darker and more terrifying than anything I had encountered in my years at Oakwood Grove. The forest I thought I knew so well was about to reveal its deepest, most chilling secrets. The next morning dawned cold and gray, a thin mist clinging to the trees like a shroud. I arrived at the ranger station just as the first hints of light were creeping over the horizon. The parking lot was already full, a mix of our own rangers and volunteers from the nearby town of Millbrook. Frank was there, looking like he hadn't slept a wink. He probably hadn't. Missing person cases always hit him hard, especially when they involved young people. "Morning, Alex," he said, his voice gruff with fatigue. "Ready to head out?" I nodded, double-checking my pack. Water, first aid kit, emergency rations, flares. Everything I might need for a long day in the woods. "Any updates?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Frank shook his head. "Nothing. Lily's friends stayed at the campsite all night, hoping she might find her way back. No luck." I felt a twinge of unease. In my experience, if a lost hiker didn't turn up within the first 24 hours, the chances of finding them alive dropped dramatically. But I pushed that thought aside. We had work to do. We gathered everyone together for a briefing. There were about 20 of us in total, a mix of experienced rangers and local volunteers who knew the area well. Frank laid out the plan, dividing us into 2 teams. I would lead one group east from the campsite, while Sarah took the other west. "Remember," Frank said, his voice carrying across the quiet morning, "we're looking for any sign of Lily. Footprints, pieces of clothing, anything out of place. If you find something, radio in immediately. Don't try to investigate on your own." There was a murmur of agreement, and then we were off, piling into our trucks for the short drive to Whispering Pines campground. As we drove, I couldn't shake a feeling of dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach. Something about this case felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on why. We arrived at the campsite just as the mist was starting to burn off. Lily's friends were there, looking even more haggard than they had the night before. Jason approached me as I got out of the truck. "Any news?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I shook my head. "Not yet, but we're just getting started. Can you show me exactly where you last saw Lily?" Jason led me to a spot at the edge of the campsite. There was a small trail leading into the woods, barely more than a game path. "She went that way," he said, pointing. "Said she wanted to get some pictures of the fall colors." I nodded, making a mental note. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. "All right, we'll focus our search in that direction. You and your friends should stay here in case she comes back." Jason looked like he wanted to argue, to insist on joining the search, but he just nodded wearily. I could see the toll the last day had taken on him, on all of them. I gathered my team and we set off into the woods, spreading out in a line about 10 feet apart. The forest was quiet, eerily so. Usually, even in late autumn, you'd hear birds calling, small animals scurrying through the underbrush. But today, there was nothing but the sound of our own footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves. We searched for hours, methodically covering ground, calling Lily's name every few minutes. But as the day wore on, we found nothing. No footprints, no scraps of clothing, not even a broken twig that might indicate someone had passed through recently. It was as if Lily had simply vanished into thin air. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I called a halt. We'd been searching for nearly 12 hours, and fatigue was setting in. Pushing on in the dark would be dangerous and likely fruitless. We made our way back to the campsite, where Sarah's team was also returning. The look on her face told me they'd had no more luck than we had. Lily's friends were still there, huddled around a small campfire. The hope that had been in their eyes that morning was fading, replaced by a growing despair. I approached them, dreading the conversation I was about to have. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice low. "We didn't find anything today, but we're not giving up. We'll be back out at first light tomorrow." Jason looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "She's still out there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She has to be." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I wanted to reassure them, to tell them that we'd find Lily safe and sound. But I'd been a ranger long enough to know better than to make promises I couldn't keep. As I turned to leave, Mia, one of the other friends, spoke up. "There's something else," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Something we didn't mention before." I turned back, my interest piqued. "What is it?" Mia glanced at the others, as if seeking permission. They nodded, and she continued. "The day before Lily disappeared, we saw someone. A man, out in the woods. That's not unusual," I said. "Lots of hikers and campers come through here." "No, this was different," Mia insisted. "He was strange, dirty, like he'd been living out here. And the way he looked at us, it was creepy." I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. "Can you describe him?" Mia nodded. "Tall, skinny, long, greasy hair, and his face, it just didn't look right. Like he'd been out here too long, you know?" I did know. Oakwood Grove attracted its share of drifters and loners, people who preferred the company of trees to that of other humans. Most of them were harmless, but there were stories. Stories of those who'd gone mad from the isolation, who'd turned feral, dangerous. "Why didn't you mention this before?" I asked, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "We didn't think it was important," Jason said. "Lots of weird people come through here, and we didn't see him again after that first time." I nodded, making a mental note to inform Frank about this new development. It might be nothing, but in a case like this, every detail mattered. "All right," I said. "Thank you for telling me. If you remember anything else, anything at all, Let us know immediately. As I walked back to my truck, my mind was racing. The strange man might have nothing to do with Lily's disappearance, but my instincts were screaming that there was a connection. And in all my years as a ranger, I'd learned to trust my instincts. I radioed Frank, filling him in on what Lily's friends had told me. He agreed that it was worth looking into, and said he'd contact the local sheriff's office to see if they had any information on drifters or transients in the area. As I drove back to the ranger station, the forest around me seemed to grow darker, more menacing. The trees that had always been a source of comfort now felt like they were hiding secrets, concealing dangers I couldn't begin to understand. For the first time in years, I felt like a stranger in these woods, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened to Lily Chen, it was just the beginning of something much darker and more terrifying than anything Oakwood Grove had seen before. The next few days passed in a blur of exhaustive searches and growing frustration. We expanded our search area, bringing in more volunteers and even a team with search dogs, but it was as if Lily Chen had simply ceased to exist. There was no trace of her, no clue as to where she might have gone. The atmosphere in Oakwood Grove had changed. The usual peace and tranquility of the forest had been replaced by a palpable tension. Even the most experienced rangers among us were on edge, jumping at shadows and unexpected sounds. It was on the fourth night of the search that things took a turn for the truly bizarre. I was at the makeshift command center we'd set up near Whispering Pines, poring over maps and trying to figure out where we might have missed something. The night was unusually still, the silence broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves in a faint breeze. Suddenly, Jason burst into the tent, his eyes wild with a mixture of fear and hope. "I heard her," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "I heard Lily." I was on my feet in an instant. "Where? When?" "Just now," he said, pointing towards the dense woods to the east of the campsite. It was faint, but I'm sure it was her voice. She was calling for help. I grabbed my gear and radioed for backup. Within minutes, a small team had assembled, and we set off in the direction Jason had indicated. The forest seemed to close in around us as we moved deeper into the woods, the beam of our flashlights barely penetrating the thick canopy above. We called Lily's name, our voices echoing unnaturally in the still night air. But there was no response. After an hour of fruitless searching, I was beginning to think that Jason's mind had been playing tricks on him. The stress and lack of sleep could easily lead to auditory hallucinations. But then I heard it too. A faint sound, barely audible over the rustle of leaves. It sounded like a voice, but it was unlike any human voice I'd ever heard. It was high-pitched, almost keening, and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my hand instinctively going to the hunting knife at my belt. The others nodded, their faces pale in the harsh light of the flashlights. We stood still, straining our ears. The sound came again, louder this time. It was definitely a voice, but the words were indistinct, garbled as if coming from underwater. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. "What the hell was that?" one of the volunteers whispered, his voice shaking. I shook my head, unable to form a coherent response. In all my years in these woods, I'd never experienced anything like this. It was unsettling, to say the least. We continued our search for another hour, but found nothing. No sign of Lily, no source for the strange voice we'd heard. As we made our way back to the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest that had always been my home now felt alien and threatening. Back at the command center, I reported what had happened to Frank. He listened with a frown, his weathered face creased with worry. "I don't like this, Alex," he said when I'd finished. "First the girl disappears without a trace, then this, whatever it was. Something's not right here." I nodded in agreement. "What do you think we should do?" Frank sighed, rubbing his temples. "For now, we keep searching. But I'm going to call in some additional help. This is starting to feel like more than just a missing person case." As I left Frank's office, I saw Lily's friends huddled together near the edge of the campsite. They looked shell-shocked, the hope that had sustained them for the past few days giving way to a growing dread. I approached them, feeling the weight of responsibility heavy on my shoulders. "Any news?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "Nothing concrete, but we're not giving up." Jason looked up at me, his eyes haunted. "It's not just Lily, is it? There's something wrong out there." I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. But these kids had already been through so much. They deserved the truth, or at least as much of it as I could give them. "We're not sure what's going on," I admitted. "But I promise you we're doing everything we can to find Lily and get to the bottom of this." As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a promise I might not be able to keep. The next morning, I woke to the sound of unfamiliar voices outside my cabin. Peering out the window, I saw Frank talking to a group of men I didn't recognize. They were dressed in civilian clothes, but something about their bearings screamed law enforcement. I quickly dressed and made my way outside. Frank saw me approaching and waved me over. "Alex," he said, "I'd like you to meet Agent Simmons and his team. They're here to help with the investigation." I shook hands with Simmons, a tall, lean man with close-cropped gray hair and piercing blue eyes. "FBI?" I asked. Simmons nodded. "Special unit, we deal with unusual cases." There was something in the way he said unusual that sent a chill down my spine. I'd always prided myself on being a rational person, someone who dealt in facts and evidence. But the events of the past few days had shaken that belief to its core. "What can you tell us about the girl's disappearance?" Simmons asked as we walked towards the command center. I filled him in on everything we knew, including the strange encounter Lily's friends had reported and the bizarre noises we'd heard in the woods. Simmons listened intently, his face betraying no emotion. "And you've never experienced anything like this before?" he asked when I'd finished. I shook my head. "Never. Oakwood Grove has always been a peaceful place, until now." Simmons nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "We'll need to speak with the friends again, and I'd like to see where you heard those sounds last night." The rest of the day was a blur of activity. Simmons and his team interviewed everyone involved in the search, pored over our maps, and combed through the area where we'd heard the strange voices. They were thorough and professional, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more than they were letting on. It was late afternoon when one of the local volunteers, a man named Tom who'd lived in the area his whole life, approached me with a worried look on his face. "Alex," he said, his voice low, "there's something you should know. Something I should have mentioned earlier, but, well, I didn't want to sound crazy." I felt my stomach tighten. "What is it, Tom?" He glanced around as if afraid of being overheard. "You remember that story about the hermit, the one who supposedly lived deep in the woods?" I nodded. It was an old local legend, one I'd always dismissed as campfire talk. The story went that decades ago, a man had gone into the deepest part of Oakwood Grove and never come out. Over the years, hikers claimed to have seen him, describing a wild-looking man with long hair and tattered clothes. "What about it?" I asked. Tom swallowed hard. "I think I saw him. About a week before the girl went missing. I was out checking my traps, and I saw this figure. At first I thought it was just a shadow, but then it moved. It was a man, Alex, but not like any man I've ever seen. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, God, his eyes were like nothing I've ever seen before. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why didn't you report this?" Tom shook his head. "Who'd believe me? Hell, I barely believed it myself. But after what's been happening, I thought you should know." I thanked Tom for the information and immediately went to find Simmons. The agent listened to my report with the same impassive expression he'd worn all day. "We'll look into it," he said when I'd finished. "In the meantime, I want you to double the patrols. No one goes into the woods alone, understood?" I nodded, feeling a mix of relief that someone was taking charge and frustration at being sidelined in my own forest. As night fell, an uneasy quiet settled over Oakwood Grove. The search teams had returned, tired and discouraged. Lily's friends sat around a campfire, their faces drawn and hopeless. I wanted to offer them some words of comfort, but what could I say? That we were now chasing ghost stories and campfire legends? I was making my final rounds when I heard it again. That same eerie, inhuman voice echoing through the trees. But this time it was closer. Much closer. I switched off my flashlight and stood perfectly still, straining my ears. The voice was clearer now, and I could almost make out words. It sounded like singing? A high, keening melody that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. And then I saw it. A figure, moving through the trees about 50 yards away. It was tall and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. As it passed through a shaft of moonlight, I caught a glimpse of its face. Tom's description hadn't done it justice. The creature, for I couldn't think of it as a man, had skin that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Its eyes were huge and black, reflecting the moonlight like a cat's. And its mouth was open far too wide, emitting that terrible, beautiful song. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to call for help. The creature turned its head, and for a moment, its eyes locked with mine. I felt a wave of cold wash over me, and in that instant, I understood why Lily had vanished without a trace, why people went missing in these woods and were never seen again. The thing in the forest wasn't just a hermit or a madman. It was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in our world. As the realization hit me, the creature's song reached a crescendo. The world around me began to blur and shift, the trees seeming to bend and twist in impossible ways. I felt a pulling sensation, as if some invisible force was trying to drag me forward. With every ounce of willpower I possessed, I tore my gaze away from those hypnotic eyes and ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Because I knew that if I did, if I looked back even for a moment, I would be lost. Just like Lily. Just like all the others who had vanished in Oakwood Grove over the years. As I burst into the clearing where our command center was set up, I saw Simmons and his team gearing up, their faces grim and determined. They took one look at me and seemed to understand. "You saw it," Simmons said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, still struggling to catch my breath. What is that thing?" Simmons checked his weapon, his face set in hard lines. "Something that doesn't belong here. Something we're going to send back where it came from." As the team moved out into the darkness, I realized that my understanding of the world had changed forever. Oakwood Grove, my sanctuary, my home, would never be the same again. And somewhere in the depths of the forest, that unearthly song continued, calling to something beyond our comprehension. The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity. Simmons and his team moved with practiced efficiency, setting up a perimeter around the area where I'd seen the creature. They brought out equipment I'd never seen before. Devices that beeped and whirred, giving off readings that meant nothing to me but seemed to concern the agents deeply. I found myself relegated to the sidelines, my years of experience in these woods suddenly meaningless in the face of whatever we were dealing with. Frank stood beside me, his face ashen in the harsh glare of the floodlights we'd set up. "What the hell is going on, Alex?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. I wish I knew, Frank. I really wish I knew. As dawn broke, casting a pale, sickly light over the forest, Simmons approached us. He looked tired, the lines on his face deeper than they had been the day before. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. "Whatever this thing is, it's not just hiding in the woods anymore, it's changing them." "What do you mean, changing them?" I asked, a knot of dread forming in my stomach. Simmons ran a hand through his hair. "It's hard to explain. The topology of the forest is shifting. Landmarks aren't where they should be. It's like reality itself is bending around this creature. I thought back to the night before, how the trees had seemed to twist and warp as the creature sang. I'd attributed it to fear and adrenaline, but what if it had been real? What about Lily? Frank asked. Is there any chance she's still... He couldn't finish the sentence, but we all knew what he meant. Is there any chance she's still alive? Simmons's face softened slightly. We don't know. But if she is, our best chance of finding her is to locate the source of these disturbances. And how do we do that? I asked. We go in, Simmons said simply. A small team, moving fast and light. We find the heart of this thing, and we end it. I nodded, straightening up. I'm coming with you. Simmons looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have convinced him. All right. But you follow my lead, understood? This isn't like anything you've dealt with before. As we prepared for the mission, I couldn't help but think of Lily's friends. They were still here, refusing to leave until they knew what had happened to her. I approached them, feeling the weight of responsibility heavy on my shoulders. We think we've found a lead, I told them, choosing my words carefully. We're going in to investigate. Jason stood up, his face set in determination. We're coming too. I shook my head firmly. Absolutely not, it's too dangerous. She's our friend, Mia argued. We can't just sit here and do nothing. I understood their frustration, their need to act. But I also knew that I couldn't risk any more young lives. The best thing you can do for Lily right now is stay here and stay safe, I said. I promise you, we're doing everything we can to find her. They didn't look happy, but they nodded reluctantly. As I turned to go, Jason caught my arm. Bring her back, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Please. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The weight of their hope, their trust, felt almost unbearable. An hour later, our small team was ready to move out. Besides Simmons and myself, there were 2 other agents, a woman named Rodriguez and a man called Chen. They carried an array of equipment I didn't recognize, along with more conventional weapons. As we prepared to enter the woods, Simmons gathered us for a final briefing. Remember, stick together. The forest isn't behaving normally. If you get separated, you may not be able to find your way back. And whatever you do, if you hear that singing, don't listen. Block it out however you can. We nodded grimly and set off into the trees. Almost immediately, I could tell something was wrong. The forest I'd known like the back of my hand for 20 years suddenly felt alien and threatening. Familiar landmarks were missing or in the wrong places. The very air felt thick and heavy, as if we were walking through water instead of air. We'd been walking for what felt like hours, though my watch insisted it had only been 45 minutes, when Rodriguez's equipment began to beep insistently. We're close, she said, her voice tense. The readings are off the charts, and then we heard it. That same haunting, inhuman song that had nearly ensnared me the night before. I saw Chen stumble, his eyes going wide and unfocused. Chen, Simmons barked. Focus! The agent shook his head as if to clear it, but I could see the strain on his face. Whatever this thing was, its power was growing. We pushed on, the song growing louder with every step. The forest around us was changing more dramatically now. Trees bent at impossible angles, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. The ground beneath our feet shifted and roiled, making every step a challenge. And then, suddenly, we were there. The heart of the disturbance. A clearing that hadn't existed yesterday, perfectly circular and filled with a swirling opalescent mist. In the center stood the creature I'd seen the night before, but now I could see it clearly. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with limbs that were too long and jointed in the wrong places. Its skin was pale and seemed to shift and ripple, as if it wasn't quite solid. But it was the face that drew the eye and chilled the soul. Those huge black eyes that seemed to contain entire universes, and that mouth, open impossibly wide, from which poured that terrible, beautiful song. For a moment, we all stood frozen, caught between awe and terror. Then Simmons snapped into action. Now! He shouted, and Rodriguez and Chen began setting up their equipment, their movements quick and practiced. The creature turned towards us, its song changing in tone. I felt a wave of something wash over me. Not quite sound, not quite emotion, but a force that threatened to overwhelm my senses. Alex! Simmons's voice cut through the haze. We need to hold it off while they work. Whatever you do, don't let it touch you. I nodded, drawing my hunting knife. It felt pitifully inadequate against this otherworldly threat, but it was all I had. The next few minutes were a blur of frantic action. Simmons and I darted around the clearing, keeping the creature's attention divided while Rodriguez and Chen worked on whatever it was they were doing. The air crackled with energy, and I could feel reality itself groaning under the strain. And then, in a lull in the chaos, I saw her. Lily. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, her eyes wide and unfocused. She took a step towards the creature, her movements jerky and unnatural. Lily, I shouted. Lily, stop! For a moment, just a moment, I saw recognition flicker in her eyes. Then the creature's song swelled, and she continued her slow, inexorable march towards it. I didn't think, I just acted. I ran towards Lily, knowing that I was putting myself directly in the creature's path. I could hear Simmons shouting something, but the words were lost in the overwhelming song. Just as I reached Lily, just as my hand closed around her arm, I felt something cold and alien brush against my back. The world exploded into a kaleidoscope of impossible colors and sounds. I felt myself falling through space and time, through realities I couldn't begin to comprehend. And then, darkness. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I finally came to, I found myself lying on a hospital bed, the steady beep of a heart monitor filling the room. My whole body ached, and my head felt like it was stuffed with cotton. As my vision cleared, I saw Frank sitting in a chair beside the bed. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, deep lines etched into his face. "Welcome back," he said, his voice rough with emotion. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and raw. Frank helped me sip some water before I tried again. "Lily?" I managed to croak out. Frank's face broke into a tired smile. "She's alive. You saved her, Alex. She's in the hospital too, but the doctors say she'll make a full recovery." Relief washed over me, so intense it was almost painful. But as the fog in my mind began to clear, other questions arose. "The creature?" I asked. "What happened?" Frank's expression grew serious. "It's complicated. Simmons and his team managed to close whatever portal that thing came through. They used some kind of advanced technology I don't pretend to understand. The creature, well, they say it's gone, back to wherever it came from." I nodded slowly, trying to process this information. "And the forest?" Frank sighed. "It's still there, but it's different. The areas closest to where we found you and Lily are off limits now. The official story is environmental contamination, but..." He trailed off, shaking his head. I understood. How could we explain what had really happened? Who would believe us? "How long was I out?" I asked, suddenly realizing I had no idea what day it was. 3 weeks, Frank replied, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. "The doctors, well, they weren't sure you were going to wake up at all." I lay back, trying to absorb this. 3 weeks. It felt like only moments had passed since I'd reached for Lily in that impossible clearing. "Lily's friends?" I asked, remembering the promise I'd made to them. "They're okay," Frank assured me. "They've been here every day, checking on both you and Lily. They're good kids." Over the next few days, as I regained my strength, I learned more about what had happened. The official report was vague, full of bureaucratic language that said nothing while implying everything. Terms like unexplained phenomenon and temporary spatial anomaly were used liberally. Simmons visited me once, the day before I was discharged. He looked tired but satisfied. "You did good out there, Thornton," he said. "Not many people could have done what you did." "And what exactly did I do?" I asked. My memories of those final moments in the clearing were hazy at best. Simmons smiled slightly. You broke its hold on the girl. Brought her back. Not many people can resist that kind of influence. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I fully understood. What was it? Where did it come from? Simmons's expression turned serious. There are things out there, Thornton. Things that exist in the spaces between what we know. Sometimes they find their way through. Our job is to make sure they don't stay. He left soon after, leaving me with more questions than answers. But I knew better than to push. Some things, perhaps, were better left unknown. A week after I was discharged, I returned to Oakwood Grove. The forest looked the same at first glance, but as I walked the familiar trails, I could feel the difference. There was a tension in the air, a watchfulness that hadn't been there before. The trees seemed to whisper secrets to each other as I passed. I found myself at the edge of the quarantine zone, staring into the depths of the forest that had once been my second home. Yellow tape and warning signs marked the boundary, but they seemed almost laughably inadequate given what lay beyond. I wouldn't go in there if I were you, a voice said behind me. I turned to see Lily, looking pale but determined. Her friends stood a respectful distance away, watching us with concerned expressions. I wasn't planning to, I assured her. How are you feeling? She shrugged, her eyes never leaving the forest. Physically, fine. The doctors say there's nothing wrong with me, but... She trailed off, and I saw a shadow pass over her face. You remember, I said. It wasn't a question. She nodded. Not everything, but enough. That song, I can still hear it sometimes in my dreams. I put a hand on her shoulder, feeling a surge of protectiveness. It's over now. It can't hurt you anymore. Lily turned to look at me, her eyes filled with a wisdom far beyond her years. Is it? Is it really over? I wanted to reassure her, to tell her that the danger had passed, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. I don't know, I admitted, but if it ever comes back, we'll be ready. She nodded, seeming to accept this. After a moment, she spoke again. I'm leaving, my friends and I. We're going back home. I nodded, understanding. How could they stay, knowing what lurked in the shadows of Oakwood Grove? What about you? Lily asked. Will you stay? I looked back at the forest, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. Someone needed to stand guard, to watch for signs that the barrier between worlds was thinning again. Yes, I said, I'll stay. Lily smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face. Good. The forest needs you, I think. As she walked back to her friends, I turned once more to face the woods. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, looking for all the world like any other forest. But I knew better now. I knew the secrets that lay hidden in the heart of Oakwood Grove, and I would be here, watching, waiting, ready to face whatever might come through from the other side. Because some sanctuaries, I had learned, needed guardians, and Oakwood Grove, for better or worse, was mine. Years have passed since that fateful autumn when Lily Chen disappeared and the fabric of reality tore open in the heart of Oakwood Grove. The forest has healed, at least on the surface. To the casual observer, it looks much as it always has, a vast expanse of green, teeming with life and natural beauty. But those of us who know the truth see it differently now. We see the scars hidden beneath the new growth, the subtle wrongness in the way certain trees grow, or the paths that seem to shift when you're not looking directly at them. I'm still here, older now, my hair grayed and my face lined with the weight of the secrets I carry. I've become something of a legend among the younger rangers and the locals in town. They call me the guardian of Oakwood Grove, though few know the real reason why. Lily visits sometimes, usually in the autumn when the leaves are turning and the air carries a hint of otherworldly chill. She's doing well, married now, with a successful career and a life far removed from the horrors she experienced here. But I can see it in her eyes when she looks into the depths of the forest, the memory of that haunting song, the pull of something beyond our world. Simmons and his team check in periodically, running tests and taking readings with equipment I still don't understand. They say everything's normal, that the breach has been fully sealed. But I notice the way their hands sometimes shake, the way they flinch at unexpected sounds from the forest. As for me, I patrol the woods every day, my senses attuned to the slightest change, the faintest echo of that unearthly song. Most days, all is quiet. But sometimes, when the wind is just right and the shadows grow long, I think I hear it, a distant melody, beautiful and terrible, calling from somewhere beyond the veil of our reality. On those days, I stand at the edge of the quarantine zone, my hand on the worn grip of my hunting knife, and I remember the promise I made to Lily, to the forest, to myself. I am the guardian of Oakwood Grove, and I will be ready, should the darkness ever return. Because some stories don't end, some songs never truly fade, and in the heart of every sanctuary, there are secrets waiting to be discovered or unleashed.